Welcome back, Cold War 5 listeners. I'm your host, Mike Dupre. Today's discussion is titled Past the Strait, Rethinking the Gulf. It's a privilege to have Ambassador Barbara Bodine joining me today. With over 30 years of foreign service to this country, Ambassador Bodine is one of the nation's most distinguished practitioners of the Middle East, having worked in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, serving as the coordinator for counterterrorism and director of East African Affairs. From 1997 to 2001, she served as the U.S. ambassador to Yemen, and has twice served in Iraq, once during the Iraq-Iran War, and later during the U.S. invasion. She has also been the Deputy Chief of Mission in Kuwait. Outside of this obviously very distinguished public career, Ambassador Bodine has served as the Dean of the School of Professional Studies at the Foreign Service Institute and Senior Advisor for International Security Negotiations and Agreements in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. You've also currently serve, as the Director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy here at Georgetown University, where we're recording today, after following tenures at the Harvard Kennedy School, MIT Center for International Studies, and you've also spent 7 years at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs as a lecturer and then director of the Scholars in the Nation's Service Initiative. And you've also been the president of the Mine Awareness Group. The conversation today focuses primarily on a capstone course that Ambassador Bodine taught last spring at Georgetown called Rethinking the Gulf. First, in laying the groundwork, beyond the Strait of Hormuz lies the Persian Gulf and a collection of states that comprise the Gulf Arab states. We have Kuwait, Iraq, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. This is a region that has long been regarded as an area of vital interest to the United States, and you also referenced the Carter Doctrine of 1980. I think that's one of the examples that can lend to this. This, of course, was a tectonic shift in U.S. policy at that time. And I guess my question in laying the groundwork is twofold. Why is the Gulf so important to the United States? And how did this importance come to be realized?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Very delighted to be here. The Gulf region has been critically important to the outside world for well over 200 years. And it comes down to the old real estate location. It sits along major shipping lines. Originally, the British were very interested in the Gulf, established a number of protectorates there to protect the trade between Iraq and India. As oil was discovered among the various Gulf states, including Iran, protecting that oil resource and the ability to export it became critical first to the British. We were only tangentially involved up until the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We kind of considered it a British lake. The British withdrew in 1970, and we still were kind of hands off. Just as long as the oil flowed, we were perfectly fine. It all changed in 1979. And that is when the center of gravity in our interest in the region became entirely different. We had, in 1 year, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian Islamic Revolution, the siege of Mecca, and the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. And with that, the Middle East was no longer the same. 1980, right after this, President Carter promulgated what we call the Carter Doctrine, which stated for the first time that the Gulf was an area of vital U.S. national interest and that we would oppose any hostile power by any means necessary. And just to make it clear, by military force if necessary. So with that, we had a very different Gulf, a very different U.S. engagement, but it still came down to the protection of shipping lanes, and the major oil resources that we were totally dependent upon, as was the rest of the international economy.
You've stated also the center of gravity in the Arab world migrated from the Levant to the Gulf. Mm-hmm. I guess outside of the United States' role in the region, how does that affect, maybe painting some broad strokes here, how does that affect the dynamics within the region between actors, at least how we operate with them?
The center of gravity politically, or in terms of security, shifted 79, 80. But at the same time, the smaller Gulf states were becoming independent. We had the oil embargoes of the 70s, so they suddenly had far more resources. With Egypt kind of out of the game because of Camp David, a lot of the power decisions shifted over to the Gulf states. You had Al Jazeera, which shifted the entire media landscape in the Middle East, in the Arab world. You had the rise of what are now considered middle powers. And also, as they were growing economically, they were dependent on foreign labor, professional class, white-collar technocrats, as well as construction. And a lot of those workers came from the Levant and North Africa. So all of a sudden, this was the economic, media, political, and security center of the world. And with the Iran-Iraq War and then our protection of the shipping lanes in 88, 89, it also became a center of U.S. military presence and U.S. military activity. We've been militarily more engaged in the Gulf region than we actually ever have been in the Levant or North Africa.
And do you think that's a testament, one, to the resources you were talking about, and maybe how have the United States' interests shifted because of the Levant?
Well, part of it is that our interest shifted. I mean, we remained interested in trying to resolve the Israel-Palestine issue. And we certainly maintained our relations. You know, Iraq is important, certainly Syria, Lebanon, major diaspora presence here. But our security concerns and our economic concerns shifted over to the Gulf. We were, until the Soviets left Afghanistan, that was a major focus. Certainly the Iranian Islamic Revolution really shifted the interest because these Gulf Arab states were under immediate threat from the Iranians. We saw the Soviets as trying to meddle, and we never like it when the Soviets or the Russians, however they are branding themselves this week, we always see that as a threat to our interest, and really cannot overstate how important the oil resources are to the entire world economy. So it was not just this was an American interest in securing oil, it was an interest in securing the world's economy.
I think that brings me to my next question, which is what you've characterized well as the historical global reliance on oil. This is something that has been and will likely always be something that we are dependent on, and this region happens to be the focal point of that. How might this change those U.S. kind of attempts to be a little bit more energy independent? Of course, no country can ever be fully energy independent, but one can hope, or one can at least attempt. I'm curious how that changes the relationship a little bit from a bargaining perspective.
Yeah, to me, the change in our dependence, U.S. dependence on Gulf energy resources, oil and gas, has changed how we need to look at the Gulf and how we interact. But we are still the major military power, and if these resources, these shipping lanes, these states' stability is threatened, it's basically going to be the United States that protects them. I will say that we are all hoping that we can lower our dependence on fossil fuels. Please see fire in Maui, among other things. But it's going to be a gradual process. I think what's important to note is that these states, and I'm talking mostly about the Arab Gulf states, they recognize that while they may have decades, if not more, oil resources in the ground, that cannot be the sole basis of their economies. In 1970, when they became independent, to be honest, they were basically seen as, they were described one point as a crouton of sand on a soup of oil, or a gas station in the middle of the desert. Neither one of those terribly kind, but for 1970, probably close to accurate. They have been working assiduously and with a great deal of success to diversify their economies away from oil dependence. Some of the states, such as the Emirates, are one of the primary investors, R&D, in alternative energy and conservation. Oman has a massive solar panel farm. So they recognize that oil is not forever, and that their economies, they've also moved into knowledge economies, a lot into banking, the kind of white-collar economies. So they understand the need to shift, and they're recalibrating themselves which means we need to recalibrate how we deal with them as well and recognize they're not the economies of 1970.
Do you think that their diversification and in some respects their sophistication that's come with that has made them an easier or sometimes a more difficult partner to work with? And do you have any examples from your time as a diplomat that might better outline that?
I would say that it's made them better partners and sometimes awkward friends, both. And we have that with many of our friends around the world. They, again, going back to 1970, when they got their full independence, they had no state structures. They had no education, health systems. I mean, they really were a crouton of sand on a soup of oil. In the intervening decades, they now have over 90% literacy, both genders. They have, sophisticated healthcare systems. They have grown their own political and governing structures. They have gone from being basically protectorates to being middle powers in their own right. They perfectly capable of figuring out what is in their national interest, their economic interest, their security interest, and devising policies and taking action on them. Some of the times it works well with our interests and values, and every once in a while it bumps up against them. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates' engagement, involvement, war in Yemen clearly was not something that we fully supported, and we have been working very hard to try to get that war ended. At the same time, a state like Qatar has been critical to our ability to evacuate out of Kabul recently, 2 years ago. We couldn't have done that without the Qataris. They are mediators in many crises. They are meddlers in the region as they see it is in their interest. And so sometimes we're working together, and sometimes we have what we call in diplomacy frank and candid discussions.
I actually really appreciate that point that you mentioned about Qatar's mediation, I guess, in the 21st century. It's really tried to take a leading role, predominantly in the Middle East, but really as a developing an international presence.
Yeah.
Are there some examples that you can speak of that would be particularly important to the United States context?
Well, I think I do not wish to underestimate, how critical they were in the final days in Kabul. We would not have been able to do that evacuation without them. They are, diplomatic term, are protecting power in Afghanistan. They remain our major channel to the Taliban. And we are very hesitant to formally work with the Taliban, but the Taliban is there. Mm-hmm. And we know we have security interests in Afghanistan, and there are humanitarian interests in Afghanistan. The Qataris and the Omanis have been critical to our ability to work with Iran. We would not have been able to have the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, without the active involvement of the Omanis. I think it's also fair to note that the Kuwaitis were critical to our ability to intervene in Iraq in 2003. Whether you think that intervention was wise or not is a different issue, but the Kuwaitis made it possible. Across the board, these states have been partners with us. They are able to talk to a number of people in the region that we don't want to talk to, but we need to have communication with. And they're able to do it in collaboration with us. So they are very important partners.
In a cliche way, if you could give a letter grade to how well the United States is doing with realizing this and utilizing this, how do you, I don't want to put you on the spot with some of your former colleagues, but I'm curious, what do you view as the state of diplomacy in that respect?
I think at this point I might give us an incomplete. I haven't seen your final paper yet. I think there is a broad understanding that whether or not we are economically dependent on them to a certain extent, the security dependence on their side is also shifting. They're more able, willing, prefer to use their own resources with our assistance and sales. I think there is an understanding that we need to partner more and try to protect less. And the conversations need to be more with instead of to. But every once in a while, I do feel that we default to a outdated view of how much they have graduated into middle power status. We have kind of a mixed bag. It's changing. It's still mixed.
Not changing fast enough, I guess.
Not changing as fast as I would like it to change. We do recognize it. It's not totally internalized. Let's put it that way. We haven't totally internalized the changes in these states.
From protectorate to partner. I think that is a nice tangential relationship to what you speak on in the actual course, which is the three principles that you see as necessary if we want to really have a great relationship with these countries. It's rethink, reframe, recalibrate.
Right.
So I kind of want to give you the floor to outline why these terms are maybe useful in a historical context, but also for future policy augmentation.
Well, the rethink is understanding these are not the states of 1970 or 1980 or 1990 when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. So we need to rethink, who they are. The reframe and recalibrate is to take some of the partnering that we do, which has a sense of ad hoc. It's issue dependent, it's circumstance dependent, and recalibrate that into the norm as opposed to, oops, we need help, who can we call? Another element of recalibrating and reframing is that we have also tended to see the Gulf states, because of their energy resources, as the bankers of choice. That we come up with a great idea and we go to the Gulf states and say, have I got a deal for you? And this even goes all the way back to Reagan and King Fahd in Saudi Arabia, where the Saudis were funding what we were doing in Angola. They were funding what we were doing in Central America, well beyond their areas of national interest. And we also had them funding a lot of projects and things that we were doing in the region. We were kind of tin cupping them. And they kind of went from a gas station in the desert to an ATM in the desert. And I think we sometimes would deal with them as if they were an ATM. It's my idea, it's in the U.S. national interest. You're our friends, ergo I need you to help fund this. Without recalibrating the conversation to be, this is a global interest. This is an issue that is of importance to you, and how do we partner together? And I think one example of this would be on humanitarian and development assistance. Another part of their moving into middle power status is they have very active and well-funded development and humanitarian programs. They've established ministries of international cooperation. They've got the structures. They have helped out in Yemen. It's a little bit of you broke it, you buy it, or you broke it, you fix it. But also in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and other places. We'll talk about what they're doing in Sudan. They are going to do what any right-thinking state will do, is calibrate, why is this in my interest? Not just to make the Americans happy. And I think that's kind of what we were doing before, that this would make us really happy if you would help us out on this. And we need to recalibrate this into, how is this in your national interest to partner and cooperate with us? And we have seen that, but we haven't, again, institutionalized it. We haven't formalized it. It's been a little bit ad hoc, and it's changing the nature of the conversation.
To that point, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about the coming of China into the international, not only the international stage, but also pertinently into the Middle East as well. Mike Sang, one of the directors over at WinUp, had a great article a few days ago that basically said that the United States still has a role to play even if China is in the Middle East. But it needs to understand what it can offer countries that China can't. And as a diplomat, what's your negotiating strategy when it comes to what American offers that other countries can't?
Yeah, China is a very interesting case. And I would do a kind of a sidebar that India is also increasingly an actor
Absolutely.
in the Gulf. If the Gulf went from being a British lake to being an American lake for a while, to get my geographic terms a little muddled, it's sort of a Gulf lake now. There's got to be a better way to put that. But China is there. They have major investments. Their ports, they love building ports. They build railroads. They build other major infrastructure. We are no longer a major consumer of Gulf energy. China is a major consumer, along with Japan and Korea, and to a large extent India. And so there was a little bit of angst when President Obama talked about his pivot to Asia and are you abandoning us? And we said, no, we're not abandoning you, but we're just recognizing there is this other major part of the world. What was ironic about their angst is that they had already pivoted to Asia in terms of who their major customers were. And so that's where most of their oil goes, ergo that's where most of their money comes from. And the Chinese, as we know, are pushing their presence abroad. We need to figure out how to work with that. China is a major competitor of ours. Surprise. It's a different kind of presence, however, from the old Cold War. The Soviets were more of a direct threat, and we did soft diplomacy, soft power. The Arab Gulf states were not particularly interested in the Soviet Union. They weren't interested in communism. They didn't particularly like them or trust them. And they saw us as very important to protecting them. China is very different. It's an economic power more than it's a military power. And they're willing to engage in ways that we simply don't. So how do we deal with this? And getting into, we are beyond the kind of simple bipolarity of the Cold War, and we're into a very multipolar, polyglobal world, and the Chinese are there. We have to sort out, where do we cooperate with the Chinese, where do we collaborate with the Chinese, where do we just accept the Chinese, and where do we have to draw a line? And this is true in the Gulf. And I think since we're not consumers of Gulf resources, we have to understand we have to share the space. The Chinese are not coming in a military way, but they are definitely there economically. Where we need to draw lines and make them clear is what level of economic engagement are we comfortable with? And we're pretty comfortable with an economic relationship. Technology is a different issue. And we had a issue in the Emirates, for example, where they are building a port. The port's a little bit close to some of our facilities, and we were concerned about the technology the Chinese were going to put in the port. And as we know, what the Chinese like to do is build a commercial port. And then, but we just want to have this little part for our military, our Navy to come and visit every once in a while. And it's kind of a salami tactic. And we went, port, fine. Oil, gas, fine. Investment, okay. Technology that is going to be a threat to our military presence, our business presence, our diplomatic presence, no. And so what we need to do is really put, where do we collaborate, where do we cooperate, where do we draw the line? And the Gulf states don't want to choose between us. They do understand these technology, and when we brought this to the attention of the Emiratis, they shut that down. So we need to have a conversation again with the Emirates and others. Sell all you like, build what you need, watch out for the toys.
The end of bipolarity, not in favor of unipolarity, which we saw in the 1990s. Now we're getting to multipolarity, which I think you had a great conversation with John Shaw at the Southern Illinois University, Paul Simon Public Diplomacy Institute, where you really brought out, we've tended at times to treat diplomacy as bilateral. That can no longer, as you describe it,
Right.
no longer be the case. What principles of multilateral diplomacy can we use to aid the transition into the multiple?
Yeah, I know what you
already
know.
happened.
Yeah, we've got too many poles going on here. The polarity is getting a little bit, as there's multilateral, minilateral, polylateral. I mean, it's gotten out of hand. Let's just say that the world is a whole lot more complex
Absolutely.
than it used to be. With the Gulf states, particularly with the GCC states, the Gulf Cooperation states, it was very much them and us, and we dealt with them bilaterally and a little bit multilaterally with the Cooperation Council. There are other players, and we recognize this, and we've recognized it around the world. The core of diplomacy and the core of relations remains bilateral, but what you need to be able to do is to look regionally. It's not just us and the Gulf states. It's us and the Gulf states. It's India. It's Iran. It's Turkey. It's relations with Israel. The circle starts spinning, wider and wider. I guess the way I would put it is that we need to work contextually. I'm going to get away from the bipolar, bilateral, multilateral stuff. And I think I would say that we need to work contextually. We need to understand the broader context within which these countries see their interest and their needs. And who are the other players, both friend and foe, and what are the opportunities? And so I would say contextualizing our diplomatic relations rather than having them as a simple bilateral. Oh, I like that. I'm going to be using that more.
Please do. That was good.
Yeah, I'm going to use that more.
I also really appreciated the point that you made, which was at times we view ourselves as an exceptional or exceptional power. In many ways, other countries are starting to view us less and less so, and we may no longer be the indispensable power in their eyes. If that's the case, how do our tactics need to change to meet that? Is there something we need to approach it?
I think my former teaching colleague here at Georgetown on one level may have regretted ever saying indispensable because we were never indispensable. I think we're still the preferred power. But they are going to draw lines. These are things that we are still going to do. We are going to normalize our relations with Iran if we think that this is in the interest of regional stability. We will play around with Sudanese warlords if we think this is good for us, even though we really don't. We are going to sell to the Chinese if that is a major customer. So I think what we just need to do is get out of that unilateral moment that we went through. I think very badly distorted some people's view of what our role is and how we play and how others have to play with us. Others don't really have to. I think that in many ways they still want to, despite our own occasional dysfunctionality with our governing structure. They still see our system as preferable to the Chinese system, certainly to the Russian system. You don't have large populations trying to go to China. You don't have large populations trying to go into Russia. So we still are, I'm not sure the light is quite as bright as it used to be, but we're still a shining city. We have to earn it. And we have to also recognize that they have options and they are going to take different options at different times. They are not going to put, as they had to in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, they are not going to put all of their security eggs in the American basket. They have developed their own military capabilities, but they've also developed their own very sophisticated, contextualized diplomacy.
Yeah.
And they are going to, what they do is, and what we're seeing globally, is it used to be called hedging, which kind of has a small state. It has the mice sort of, trying to avoid being trampled by the elephants. They're now no longer mice. They are going to have complex relationships based on different needs, and we need to work with that. It's not an either or between us and the Russians. It's not an either or between us and the Chinese. It's trying to figure out how do we all share this space in the niches that we are best suited to.
I do also wonder, I think, maybe this is an optimistic look, I do think the Middle East is one of those areas that will probably be more feasible than, say, the South China Sea or Latin America in some respects.
Well, certainly than the South China Sea, because it's not an immediate security interest to the Chinese. And I think to a certain extent the Chinese are perfectly happy having us be the security guarantors, and they can come in and buy as much oil and gas as they like, and they know that the area is going to be stable and secure. So I don't see the Chinese as trying to replace us. I don't think they want to put the kind of naval forces into the Gulf for security and stability that we have, because they want those naval forces in the South China Sea. So I think the Chinese are more than willing to share the space with us. We can certainly share it with them. I will say that for the Chinese on another side, having as much as our naval forces in the Gulf also means our naval forces are not in the South China Sea. So they're perfectly comfortable with this arrangement. It suits their needs very well. And it suits the needs of the Gulf states. There are a number of other, the Turks have a major military facility in Doha. It's well over 3,000 people. That's big size. The Iranian Navy is increasingly present in the Gulf. The French have a naval base in the Gulf. The British are back. And so there's a lot to go around. And it's a question that we need to learn, as you do in kindergarten, how to play well with others.
Yeah. One of the best examples we can probably lend to at least the attempt to play well with others would be the JCPOA.
Right.
Under the Obama administration, where the P5+1,
Yeah.
Power 5 being the UN Security Council, for those unfamiliar with the term, was an opportunity to really get everyone's needs and interests met in
Right.
one document. Of course, there were complications with it. It has since been revoked on the American side. From that agreement, was there anything that you saw as particularly valuable that we can utilize in future agreements or future attempts at an agreement?
Yeah.
That you
Well, I mean, I think the JCPOA was a good agreement. It wasn't perfect. No agreement is going to be. It was focused on one issue and one issue only, was the nuclear. And I think, as somebody said at the time, yes, we did not get to missile proliferation. We were more concerned with what was going to be armed on the missile. Let's take care of what is the armament, and then we can worry about the delivery system. And I do think that the previous administration's walking away from the JCPOA was not in anyone's interest. It was, we had the Europeans played their role, the Chinese played theirs, the Russians played an important role. The Gulf states were very much, as I noted much earlier, we would not have been able to have the JCPOA if it had not been for the Omanis. They were absolutely fundamental. Whether or not we can get back to a JCPOA 2.0, we almost made it, we didn't. Again, one thing about diplomacy is that it is not static, and one of the major changes is not just the demonstrations and protests in Iran and the crackdown, which was an issue. The Iranians have pushed the envelope on production and capabilities. They're about as close to that line as you can get. I do think the Iranian collaboration with Russia on drones in Ukraine has been a game changer. And I only read the headline this morning, but apparently the Russians and Iranians now have an agreement to produce thousands of drones. And so I think the ability to get to JCPOA 2.0, but as an example of how you can work collaboratively with countries that you're not necessarily friendly with. We had Russia, we had China in that agreement, is a model going forward. I think another way that that we've also learned to play well with others is it was the Chinese who brokered the Iranian-Saudi agreement. Mm-hmm. Now, Oman was working on that, Qatar was working on that, Iraq was working on that, everybody was working on that. It takes a village to come up with a peace agreement. But the Chinese were the ones who were finally able to get it over the line. And we welcomed that because we knew that we did not have the diplomatic ability to do that. It took an outside party who had the gravitas but sufficient neutrality to be able to broker the agreement between those two, but had the gravitas, as I said, to be able to guarantee it. And so good on them. We're not going to try to undermine that agreement simply because it wasn't invented here. So I think what we're seeing is more of this informal, contextualized minilateralism as the way of brokering deals and of getting pockets of stability where you need them, and then hoping that those pockets will connect.
Yeah. One of the contentions with the JCPOA going into it, at least in my capstone project that I did into it, was the attempt, even when I was conducting the project, was there's always layers to every issue, and everyone's interest keeps going out and out and out and out and out. And if you look at it in that context, you're never going to be able to get an agreement.
Right.
And in that sense, I think was the issue with that. Could be the issue with future dealings. I think one way that I found to mitigate it, at least in the research I was conducting, was to deal with international partners. I think it was a good idea to incorporate the UN and things. Yeah. I guess this is a good time to bring up the Gulf Cooperation Council and their ability to enhance regional security and whatnot. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on not only capabilities of the GCC, but what are your thoughts with it going forward? What role can the United States play with it?
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the JCPOA, that it was either going to be very narrow, let's just do the nuclear, or it was going to start spinning out into so many other, I always called it the missiles and meddling issue. I think that we were right to focus on nuclear as a way of starting a relationship and starting a dialogue where we could get to missiles and we could get to meddling, but that was not the view of the previous administration. In reconstructing, that's going to be extremely hard. The GCC it's one of those organizations that absolutely has to be, but is actually very limited in what it can do. Even ASEAN, which is a loose organization, is able to pull together on core issues such as South China Sea. The GCC has never been able to truly gel. They were created primarily by the Emiratis as a recognition that particularly the smaller Gulf states sitting between Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran were just fat pigeons, just waiting to be, plucked. Yeah. And that you needed to be organized in order to balance, even if they brought Saudi Arabia into the GCC. And certainly with the Iran-Iraq War, which was used as the basis to create the GCC, because we're going to be neutral in the Iran-Iraq War. They did not want Iran or Iraq in the GCC. The war allowed them to do that. But even though superficially they're all Arab, they're primarily Sunni, they're all monarchies of some kind, it looks like it is a club of very similar states. The problem is that there are very deep fissures and very deep differences and a lot of wariness about their neighbors, going back centuries in many cases. And we the United States, I'm not in the government, but we, the United States, have tried repeatedly to get the GCC to either be a stronger defense cooperation agreement or more like the EU, a more cooperative economic union. Pick one if you don't want to do both.
Exactly.
And it's never really quite happened because there isn't the fundamental trust with their neighbors. And, we had the Qatari blockade, which I do recall the Saudi foreign minister saying the purpose of the blockade is to bring Qatar to heel. That's pretty rough language. And it didn't work. And then they all signed an agreement and said, okay, fine, they almost put that in the oops column and, we'll move on and we will kind of almost pretend it doesn't happen. But nobody's forgotten. And there's always this sense of, the Kuwaitis and the Omanis supported the Qataris, the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, and the Saudis were on the other side. So all of a sudden, the 6-member GCC is divided into 2 just about warring camps. They're now back together, but they look over each other's shoulder. And kind of one of our roles as friends to the broader family is to kind of moderate some of that. And when there was the blockade, despite the former president's initial support for what the Saudis and Emiratis were doing, we ultimately turned around and said, no, wait a minute, this Qatar is a friend of ours, back off. But they're still looking over each other's shoulder. I was talking to some Qataris and they said, it would be really good if we could develop a mediation mechanism within the GCC to head off these kinds of crises. Yeah. The fact that they think they need a mediation mechanism says everything you need to know about the GCC. It is a partner, but it is not an entity.
Yeah. The last question I have for you today is unrelated really to the Middle East, and more so to you personally as a diplomat. You've long advocated for a reorientation of how we train future diplomats, and I think that scenarios or that necessity might be true in the Middle East, and I guess as it relates to this conversation. After so many years in the Foreign Service, you've obviously been in academia, you've been in teaching roles. I'm sure you've done a lot of on-the-job training, quote unquote. Maybe what are some lessons, training skills that you wish you had in your toolkit before you went into the Foreign Service, or maybe students that are listening in should look to acquire for maybe smoother sailing in their careers?
We're constantly wrestling with how do you train a diplomat. It's often people will talk about, well, the military does all this training, and diplomats don't get the same kind of training. And even though we did have 2 forever wars, part of it was that the military is expeditionary by definition, and most of the military is not engaged in armed hostility all the time, even when we had 2 wars going on. Diplomacy, you're doing it all the time. You're doing it every single day. It's a 24/7 profession, and so it's an intuitive profession. I don't know quite if that makes sense. It's not a skills. And you can make somebody a better diplomat, but you can't actually create a diplomat. And in working with students and with those going into the Foreign Service, and I guess when I was, the couple of things that I always stress if you want to do this job well and effectively, and I just did an orientation program yesterday, so I have most of my talking points still in my head, is first of all, read history. We tend to be an ahistorical society. The rest of the world is not. They are deep into history. And we actually carry our history with us too. We just don't understand that. But understand their history. If the Qataris and Bahrainis are having, kind of sniping at each other, why? Not just why 6 months ago, why 6 years ago, 6 decades ago, and maybe back into the, 1700s. Understand the history. Really understand the culture. Who are these people? What motivates them? Why do they see the world the way they do? And I will often make a comparison to a chess player. A chess player understands the person on the other side of the board and how they're going to act and why they're going to act. You need to have that level of intelligence. So deep history, deep understanding of who they are, and then contextualize everything that you do. If you're assigned to Abu Dhabi, you need to know Oman and everybody else. You need to understand Iran. You need to know the people around. So, and so I would say those kinds of things. I'm a big advocate of always asking the question, why? Why is something happening? Not what happened. Why did it happen? And then you can start working on how do we get to a policy to respond.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Bodine, for your time. I really appreciate you coming in today. This was an awesome conversation.
Well, thank you.
But I don't wanna miss you, baby.